Welcome to Forging Plowshares, a community dedicated to cultivating the peaceful kingdom of God. We hope this part of our ongoing conversation stimulates your mind and challenges your heart about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Please stay tuned at the end of the podcast for a short message about our ministry.
In this sermon, I trace the history between the Antiochenes and the Alexandrian church on the issue of the Logos and the identification of Jesus of Nazareth with the Logos. There is a divide between the Eastern and Western churches, which is not exactly correct in that there is a kind of mixture in both instances. But for the most part, there's two very different conceptions of Christology, cosmology, God, even predestination, and of course, ultimately salvation. I think that this can mostly be traced then that the West will divide the Logos from the person of Christ. Of course, more severely in the case of Theodore Mopsuestia and in Nestorius, which it's condemned. But the East has a long tradition of identifying Jesus directly with the Logos that will come to be called Neo-Chalcedonianism. And so the East has mostly identified Christ's suffering and death as divine suffering and death. And the West has tended to mitigate this through two natures, so that it is only the human Jesus and not the divine Logos or the divine Son of God who suffers. This has resulted in two very different pictures of God's relation to creation and even the nature of salvation. And so in this sermon, I attempt then to run down this history and point out then the gradual separation that occurs, that of course it occurs originally in Arianism, but the question is if the two natures is a result then of simply moving a notch over from Arianism so that the divide is in the person of Christ in the form of the two natures so that Christ is split open. Now, obviously, there is I think, an orthodox use of the two natures that even Cyril will talk about this, but ultimately in someone like Maximus, but even in the Neo-Chalcedonian formula, there's an acknowledgement of the two natures, but there is a way of thinking of this that I think divides Christ and a way of thinking of this that brings those two natures clearly together in the person of Jesus. We do have an upcoming class going to be taught by Jonathan Toddy on the book of Colossians. The class will run through June and July, an 8-week course. We are planning to meet on Tuesday, but if this is a problem, let me know, and we can try to come up with an alternative. But for the most part, we're thinking Tuesday, unless I hear differently, and we'll decide the time then when we have enough to get a consensus. But I hope you can join this class. We're going to use a book by Rowan Williams, Christ, the Heart of Creation, along with the book of Colossians then to develop an understanding of Christology. We greatly appreciate your donations. Forging Plowshares and Plowshares Bible Institute both appreciate any donations that can be made. You can give on the Outreach International website, oionline.org, through PayPal or Simple Give. And our project number is FP3901. So just select our project number when donating. And we appreciate the gifts that you might give. This is the way that we're able to continue this ministry. And you might then also think of signing up for the upcoming class. Registration is now open for the book of Colossians with Jonathan Toddy. But hope you enjoy the sermon then on the Neo-Chalcedonian resolution. John 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. Then skipping down to verse 9. There was true light, which coming into the world enlightens every man. He was in the world, and the world was made through him. And the world did not know him. He came to his own, and those who were his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, even to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we saw his glory, glory as of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. So let me begin with a foolish question. Who is this Word?
It's capitalized.
It is capitalized. And I think we should take that seriously. He is God. He is Creator. He is the source of life, light, and truth. He dwelt with God and is also the one who became flesh, is incarnate, who dwelt among us in the incarnation as the only begotten Son of God. He is divine and human. But the story of the Word, of the Logos is just the Greek word here for word. God made flesh. It has really been thrown into question in many churches. Maybe we could divide it east and west, and this isn't entirely fair. But the East has maintained a more complete identity of Jesus Christ with the Logos, where Western churches would divide the Logos from the humanity of Jesus. The East has a long tradition, though, of identifying Jesus Christ directly with the Logos, which has an important series of implications. Where the East has identified Christ's suffering and death as divine suffering and death, the West has tended to split Christ into two natures, with the suffering and death, that's the human Jesus, and that's not the divine Logos or divine Son of God who suffers. And so they're going to take Logos, Son of God, as divine and not human. And this has resulted then in two very different pictures of God's relation to creation, the nature of salvation, with the West focused on a legal theory and the East focused on a real-world deliverance and healing. Maybe to state this in the broadest terms, in one understanding, the gospel tells of work done by a God antecedently and otherwise determined, a kind of hidden Logos. And in the other, the gospel tells us who and what God is. The story of Jesus of Nazareth could be identified with the story of God. The starkness of these two alternatives, it's been mediated through secondary issues such as the role of Mary, the nature of Christ as Son, distinctions within the Trinity. But I think that what was at stake was the degree to which the story of Jesus of Nazareth could be identified with the story of God. The identification of Jesus with God. Now that doesn't fit the philosophical understanding of God's impassibility, his incapacity for suffering. And so in the early church, the first heresy, they just deny Christ's divinity. The Arian escape, that's the initial response for those subordinationists committed to a Greek understanding. And so one of the first church councils, the Council of Nicaea, it accentuates the bringing together of humanity and deity. The one who underwent gestation, birth, growth, rejection, torture, execution is true God. They just point blank say that. Subordination then had said Jesus was less than God, and of course that relieves the strain. There's no problem then. But Nicaea, and of course I think the New Testament, forces a new expression. But we get the same problem. We could divide these two up, and generally it's been called the Alexandrian school of Christology, identified with the East, that acknowledged the dissonance. And maybe we could just have them say this: we have no idea how the Son, who is true, and therefore, of course, impassible God, can have suffered. But it happened. In other words, they just embrace the paradox. The Antiochenes school refused this dissonance and attempted to say something like the Arian compromise by distinguishing between Jesus the Son, who suffered, and God the Son. They're going to make that distinction. God the Son, who alone is true God. God the Son is divine, and therefore does not suffer. But within the same person is another nature which suffers with humanity. And so the Antiochean escape is really the Arian escape moved a notch. Now, instead of subordinating the one who suffers to less than God, which no longer is allowed by Nicaea, the Antiocheans make a distinction within Christ, assigning part of him to deity, the impassible part, and part of him to humanity, the suffering part. And so the Greek philosophical ontology could be spared by prying open a different place within Jesus. The split within Christ would be negotiated in a variety of terms. But the Antiocheans prevailed inasmuch as the unified image of Christ of the New Testament was displaced by distinctions identified within deity. And so they're going to say, Logos is the deity part. Word, Son of God. And these then are something other than the human Jesus. I think that's a direct denial of what we just read. The unified understanding of Jesus as Christ, Logos, Son of God, Son of Mary, the second member of the Trinity, which was once assumed, but a gap was opened. And now Jesus is, the way they'll say it, is one with the Son, or one with the Word, as a relation rather than as direct identity. And so Theodore of Mopsuesta, he describes this. He's developing the idea of two natures that will become standard in the Western Church. He is God because of his close conjunction with the divine nature, who really is God. In other words, Jesus, the man, is not really God. In his commentary on John, he sorts out each clause of the narrative and says, well, this is Logos, divine, with its deified conjunction, his word. And this is the man. Jesus of Nazareth is not directly the Logos or one of the Trinity. But inasmuch as he is Son, Logos, or Word, he exists in relation to the second identity of the Trinity. There's almost a complete split, in other words. A clear distinction between his two natures, conjoined as they might be. And even the saving, we say Jesus saves. He uses that phrase and questions it. Or, his flesh is life-giving. Theodore says, well, only inasmuch as Jesus is conjoined to the Logos. But you can't really just say Jesus saves. God saves. And so Theodore's distinction of Logos from the man Jesus, at some level or another, this becomes standard in the Antiochean thought. Now this is all pushed too far by Nestorius. But according to Nestorius, the incarnate God did not die, but raised him in whom he was incarnate. And it used to be very popular to say Mary is the mother of God, to kind of emphasize this paradox. I think this was purely to express the mystery. He says Mary is not Theotokos. This was a step too far for all of those in the imperial church, and so Nestorianism is condemned in the councils. But in the process, the Alexandrians find a champion in a man named Cyril of Alexandria, who takes up the Alexandrian cause in opposing Nestorius. And his concern was for continuity of divine agency throughout the gospel story. That is, that the gospels are God's own story. The story of Jesus is God's story. He says, we confess that the very one who is only begotten God, and who is indeed according to his own nature impassible, he doesn't deny that, but he suffered in the flesh for us. He embraces then the paradox. And he says, confession must include the death according to the flesh of the only begotten Son of God. And so his point is a direct refutation of the Antiochenes doctrine aimed at dividing Christ. And so he says, we confess one nature of God the Logos that has been enfleshed. There is a singular subject. To state it point blank, the Logos is Jesus. The Logos is human. And that's what John is saying. Now, even Cyril acknowledges there may be a legitimate way to speak of two natures. If by this we mean Jesus is everything required to be God the Son, deity, and this particular human being. He instantiates each in who he is. And so maybe he acknowledges there's an abstract understanding allowing for two natures, that Christ is from two natures, but not a concrete distinction between the two. Now, unfortunately, the two councils, the Council of Ephesus and then the Council of Chalcedon, they set out very strongly in a statement Cyril's claims. But they also want to satisfy the Antiochean claims. So Pope Leo, who did not attend, but he sent some representatives, and he sends a letter. And he says in his letter, and by the way, this letter is attached to the ultimate creed that the councils produced. He says, for each nature is agent of what is proper to it, working in fellowship with the other. The Word doing what belongs to the Word, and the flesh what belongs to the flesh. The one who shines forth in the miracles, the other submits to the injuries. In other words, each nature does its own thing and goes its own way depending on the circumstance. And we can divide it up. But Leo's representatives, they ensured that his views are going to be reflected in the statement. And really from this time on, the East and the West are going to read the Council of Chalcedon in two different ways. In the West, Leo's position takes hold, and that's the interpretation. But the Egyptian and the Syrian churches, they will always remain suspicious of Chalcedon. And eventually these churches become completely separate churches. Those of Cyril's followers who remained in the imperial church, they would interpret Chalcedon and the word hypostasis, the union, with a slant, a Cyrilian slant from Cyril. And they made hypostasis mean what they thought it should mean, making it the, quote, synthetic agent of the whole gospel narrative, both of what is divine in it and what is human in it. And they identified the eternal Logos as himself this hypostasis. This is John of Damascus, one of these Alexandrians. Since Christ is one and his hypostasis is one, it is one and the same who wills and works divinely and humanly. And since Christ is one and the same who wills according to each nature, the concrete will is one and the same. Thus he did not do human things in the human way, for he is not only man but also God, whence it is that his sufferings are life-giving and salvific. He's quoting Theodore's statements here and refuting them. Nor does he do divine things in the divine way, whence it is that he performed divine signs by touch and speech. And so John's point is clear. Jesus is the Logos. God, the Logos, was not united to flesh antecedently, hypostasized in itself, but came in his own hypostasis to dwell in the womb of the Holy Virgin and hypostasized from the holy blood of the Virgin, flesh animated by a rational soul. He's trying to state it as strongly as he can. Jesus is the Logos. And in this understanding, which identified the union, the hypostasis with Logos, as one agent of salvation, we can call this Neo-Chalcedonianism. So it's from the Chalcedonian Council, but it's a kind of Eastern understanding. And so the Cyrilians or the Alexandrians, they ensure that at the Second Council of Constantinople, which by the way is made up mostly of Eastern bishops, this Neo-Chalcedonian understanding was made dogma at Constantinople. But it actually didn't have much effect in the West because this is mainly the Eastern communion surrounding Constantinople, and so the Western Church mostly ignored the Second Council of 553 at Constantinople. But then Maximus the Confessor, his dates are 579 to 662, he inherits and builds upon the Neo-Chalcedonian identity. He says Jesus is not alternatively one and then alternatively another nature, but he is directly from, and he uses the word from where Chalcedon had used in. He's from both, not from as a sequential relation, in time or before time, but simply as an abstract description made concrete in Jesus Christ. The second identity of God, he says, is directly the human person of the Gospels, in that he is the one who stands to the Father in the relation of being eternally begotten by him. What God is doing in Christ, it is not secondary to who he is, but Jesus in his healing, his peaceable, kenotic love is God, is divine. And thus Maximus claims that one of the Trinity suffered in the flesh. This is not a suffering exterior to God, but God suffering in the Son. Suffering God, Maximus says. Now this is not any different than the early church. I don't think it's any different from the New Testament, but we have a statement as early as Sardis of Mileto. He lived 100 to 180. Would still be alive when John was alive, maybe. And he says, paradoxically, he says, the impassible suffered. God was killed. And the Neo-Chalcedonian developments, I think, of Maximus, they don't really ease the paradox. Maybe they accentuate the paradox in saying that the suffering Son is the Logos of the presumed impassible Father. So I think the near loss of this understanding, this Neo-Chalcedonian insight, which I just think is there in John, it stunts theology in nearly all of its phases. But most particularly, it has helped to foster a very different view of God the Father than the Son Jesus. It has helped foster a violent image of God and a violent atonement. Now, both East and West, there is a sense in which this has been more embraced in the East, but lost for both of them to various levels. And both East and West have embraced various levels of violence. But it is ultimately, I think, the Neo-Chalcedonian understanding, in its direct identity of God with Christ, that most fully opens up the possibility of understanding God rightly. That God is peaceable, God is loving, and His kingdom and the saving purpose of Christianity are found in this identity of Jesus Christ with the Logos, as John affirms. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. We encounter God in the flesh, and this is the salvation which Christ brings.
Forging Plowshares is a community dedicated to cultivating the peaceful kingdom by providing in-depth, transformative biblical and theological education and discipleship. If you have found this podcast valuable, please remember to share on social media. If you have questions about what you've heard, or if you'd like to learn more about how you can get involved with Forging Plowshares or even support this ministry financially, please visit our website, forgingplowshares.org.